So this is chapter 1.2. Alright, so 1.2 in the notes, as I said, download the notes, follow along in the discussion. First thing we're going to talk about is unit classification. Alright, the first question is, well, what is a unit, right? For Rand, a unit is an individual component, right? An individual component of at least two members. An individual component of at least two members. And what does that mean? Imagine that we are looking at the set, right? We're looking at the set triangle, triangle, square. So that when we talk about the totality of the set contains three members, three individual sort of units, right? Three identifiers. And we want to do an analysis, right? We want to do sort of an epistemological analysis of this set, triangle, triangle, square, using Rand's Objectivist Epistemology. What sense can we make of this in an attempt to understand what a unit is, right? Unit classification. So, for example, imagine that we have the set triangle, triangle, square. In this set, we recognize that this square is not a unit. It's not a unit, right? The square is not a unit. Why? Because we recognize from the definition that a unit is an individual member, right? An individual component, rather, of at least two members. So there has to be at least, there could be more, but there has to be at least two members in order to classify this member as a unit, right? So here, what we would have are two units, and these units are triangles, right? So there's two units in this set. Okay, so triangle and triangle are two units of a group that we will classify as triangle. So two units of a group which we'll call triangle. And the name we give it is not really important, right? We can call this whatever we'd like to call it, as long as the word refers to these two things, right? The entities themselves. Okay? So, roughly speaking, what is a unit? A unit is an individual member, right? An individual component of at least two members, right? An individual component of at least two members. The next thing is that the group classification, the classification of these two things as triangles, is constituted by each member, right? So that this group classification, right, is contingent on the individual units, right? Makes sense, right? The group is triangle, and the group is composed of individual units. Pretty simple enough. Hopefully that's clear, right? The next thing to recognize is that in discussing unit classification, there is a method of identifying members within a group, right, or components within a group, right? There's a method of identification. And this is the second stage of existence. We recognize that insofar as we're talking about identification of a thing, identification is contingent on perception, right? My perception of something. Again, the first level of consciousness is sensual experience, sensation. Insofar as we have sensation, we come to recognize the entity, the thing, that is. Second stage of conscious awareness, or consciousness specifically, is perception. In perception, we come to identify identity. We recognize that this thing is. Last phase, concept formation. And this is what we're attempting to get to, the idea of concept formation. How do we come up with the concept? The clue should be that the concept comes from this ability to group, right? So if you think that, and if you've been thinking that, the way we get towards the idea of concept formation is through a recognition of grouping, then you're absolutely right there. That's where she's going, right? We're not quite there yet, but that's the trajectory. Unit classification is based on the perception in reality for her, right? In order to talk about unit classification, it would be incoherent for Rand to begin with the infinite, right? You cannot talk about unit classification if you talk about unit classification beginning with the infinite, right? We cannot begin with the infinite, right? We cannot begin You cannot begin with the infinite. Why? Because precisely classification is based on perception in reality. We cannot begin with the infinite. Why? Because we cannot perceive the infinite. We create the infinite, however, as a collection of perceptions. What in the world does that mean? For Rand, briefly, and I'm going to get to it in a little bit more detail later, but just to give you an idea where it's going, she talks about my ability to recognize a measurement of distance. And that measurement of distance is contingent on my foot, right? So we say a foot is, literally a foot is a measure of distance. And I can extrapolate this idea of foot, 1 foot, 2 feet, 3 feet, 4 feet, extrapolate that into miles. She says extrapolate that into light years. And now I can talk about light years and galaxies and eventually the concept of infinity, but I cannot perceive that infinity. So for her, the unit, as she says, the classification of unit is based in reality. And that basis begins inherently with me. It begins with the recognition that I am the measurement of all that is, right? Some people use this, and Rand maybe even, I can't really say, I don't really care. If this is a little too egocentric, I'm not really interested in presenting her moral theory. I'm an epistemologist myself. Whether or not it's too egocentric, or whether it's not too, based on sort of this conception that man is the measure of all things is not really important to me personally. What is important is her analysis that, and I think she's absolutely right, I don't think it's arguable, that we have arrived at the concept of infinity, but we didn't begin with the concept of infinity. The concept of infinity is a result of my being, the fact that I am, and the fact that I use my physical body and extrapolate that to the infinite, right? I think that's what she's saying, and I think she's absolutely right. For Rand, unit, this concept of unit, which I'm going to go into more detail in the classification of unit, this concept of unit is the link between metaphysics and epistemology. And the question is, well, what is metaphysics and epistemology, right? So